What will you and your party do to stop climate change? And what ideas do you have to incentivize farmers and municipalities to address runoff in the Cedar Valley watershed area?
Climate change. If you visited my website, you'll see that I say I'm not a climate denier. I'm a believer in Greenland. I, as an engineer, as a scientist, am looking at some of the data in regard to climate and climate change. The real issue comes down to, is it caused by man's activity, or is it just something that's just happened? And I don't believe it's man-made activity. For example, Greenland, in the period from 900 to about 1400 AD, was a warm place where the Vikings had settlements all over the place. Today, Greenland is 80% covered with ice and snow. The question we need to ask is, how did Greenland become warm during that period? Where were the cars, where were the trucks, where was all the man-made activity that caused it to become warm? And there have been several warm periods throughout our history. During the time of Christ, there was a Roman warming period. It cooled off later on, got warm again with Greenland and the Vikings. So there's some basic questions we need to ask. Just piling up the atmosphere with carbon dioxide doesn't make the atmosphere warm. You have to have a heat source. What is that heat source? The sun, okay? The sun can change its energy radiance instantly. In 1859, there was a solar EMP pulse. It fried telegraph lines and telegraph keys all around the world. It could happen again. We can't control warming, okay? As much as we'd like to think so, we can't do it. So I don't think that it's a CO2 problem. I think it's a propaganda problem, which is sad. And it's being used for a lot of people to make money, number one, and to our disadvantage. So if the planet's gonna warm, it's gonna warm because of the sun. There's nothing we're gonna do about it. We can see it happening. We need to take necessary steps to prevent damage to our infrastructure and places in our living spaces. But it's not about man-made activity causing it. So that's the big driver. Now you had another part to that question, but I'm almost out of time, so.
Okay. Did you want the other part?
Yeah.
Okay. It had to do with the watershed.
Watershed. Okay, I'll just say real quickly that I think the plan we have in place to basically let the farmers develop methodologies that ensure the care of our water and resources and put in place those practices which are beneficial is the way to go. Let them discover those things, put them into place, and let's see how they work, and then we can talk about whether mandates will be necessary.
Thank you. Senator Hogg.
It is a big question to answer in 2 minutes. That was kind of a joke. So, first of all, I don't think there's any question that the human contribution to climate change is real. We've had this week another report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Later this week, I've been told that there's going to be another statement from the climate scientists who work at Iowa colleges and universities across our state. And it is real, it is serious, it requires action. In Iowa, what are the consequences? We've already seen a 40% increase in extreme precipitation events over the last century. That's one of the reasons we're seeing so many flooding events now, whereas, say, when I was a kid, we didn't see it. And that is one of the expected consequences of climate change in Iowa. Around the world, there are obviously other very serious consequences, and I just will tell you right now, I think about the people from Florence and Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Harvey, and now we got Hurricane Michael. And at some point, our country needs to unite to act to address this problem. In Iowa, we really need to do a better job on water management. And I was disappointed this past year when, past 2 years, when the Republicans cut the Iowa Flood Center by $328,000. I was disappointed when they cut the DNR and the DNR floodplain program and REAP and the Leopold Center, and a lot of things that we're doing to try to solve those problems. But there is a pathway forward, and clean water and clean energy is important for the environment. It's also important for jobs. And I have proposed comprehensive water, flood, and drought legislation, Senate File 2161, to bring people together throughout watersheds, to have accountability, to work together, to achieve results. And that's the direction I think we need to move as a state. And I hope people here will support that. I hope we get support from people across the state.
Thank you. Okay, Rob, you will be first on the next question. What is your plan to increase access to quality, affordable childcare in Iowa for children ages 0 to 5?
Well, early childhood education, including childcare, is very important. It's where 90% of the brain growth of a child happens, and so we need every kid to get off to the best start as possible. And I will say this, for people who do not have children, what's in it for you? What's in it for you is making sure that we have the workforce that we need today, because the parents are worried about childcare and early childhood education. So we need it for the workforce today, and obviously we need it for the workforce in our future. Iowa has a poor record on supporting childcare. We have the lowest level of income eligibility for childcare assistance in the country. We do not take full advantage of federal funds that are available for childcare assistance. And what I have been told is that we're only reaching about 40% of the kids who are eligible for childcare assistance. So what should we do? We should expand eligibility for childcare assistance. We should reverse the budget cuts that Republicans and Governor Reynolds have passed for early childhood education. They've actually cut early childhood education over $1 million over the last 2 years. And we need to reverse those cuts, expand childcare assistance. And I really want us to get to the point where we are trying to provide universal, high-quality childcare and early childhood education. Not mandating it for the kids, but making sure it's universally available across our state so all of our kids can get off to the best start as possible in life.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
Here's why we need childcare. This has to do with cherishing your family. 70% of black kids go to bed at night without a dad in the home. 50% in the Latino community, 25% in the black community. In the black community, back in 1960, when it was 25%, that was a travesty. When you take a father out of the home, you're 5 times more likely to live in poverty, 9 times more likely not to finish school, 20 times more likely to go to prison. One of my initiatives is this. We need to build stable two-parent families. We need to incentivize people not only getting good premarital counseling, getting married, staying married, raising their kids, and staying together. That's how we need to fix childcare. I'm not against the state having funds and money to help families, single-parent families. They have the hardest job on the planet, bar none. But the point is, we need to aim for the ideal. And the ideal is 2 parents working together to raise their kids. And that's less cost for the state. The state can come in with assistance, but you know what? If you have 2 parents, 2 people working together to raise a family, the stats are on your side. The stats are on your side.
Thank you. Okay, Bernie, you get the next question first, and it's a good segue. What are you doing to address racial and income disparities in Linn County, and how do you plan to represent diverse populations in your district?
Diverse. Well, let me start with the racial thing. I shared some stats about families, and particularly the black family. In the black community, the #1 cause of death is abortion. 1,800 kids every day. Every day. We're 13% of the population. We account for 36% of the abortions. In the black community, the homicide rate is 8 to 10 times higher than what it is in white and Latino communities combined. We account for 52% of the assaults in this country, and we are 47% of the victims. It's devastating. It's devastating. Okay? So we need to start with some basics, like I just shared, building stable 2-parent families. Once we do that, I think we can then address how we get along, how we see ourselves, not as victims, but as people with an ideal and living for that ideal. As Americans that share those same ideals. In my own life, I've traveled around the world, I've interfaced with people from different countries and so on. I love diversity. I love variety. So I think by sharing those same ideals is one way that we can communicate with people, our values, our working together, our living together. In many instances, I've been the only black guy on the project, or the only black guy in town. I was in the Czech Republic, and some kids came up to me, they wanted to take my picture. I think I was the only black kid in that part of the Czech Republic at that time. And it's like, okay, this is fun. But I think it begins with our whole outlook and our whole attitude on life. And frankly, my background and my attitude has been, it doesn't matter what your skin color looks like, it doesn't matter if your language is different, you're a person that God made, and you deserve to be loved, and I have a debt to love you. So, that's my view.
Thank you. Senator Hogg.
Well, it's a very important question, and it's actually, unfortunately, because of the situations in national politics right now, probably more important than ever for us to address the issue. I have long been inspired by what people in the civil rights movement achieved, and I had always thought that that was forever and for good, and it was just a little over a year ago that the President of the United States said that white supremacists were very fine people, that there were very fine people among white supremacists. I have been concerned at the outward displays, even in Cedar Rapids, of Confederate flags. And I think we need to send a very clear message that there is no room for hate and there is no room for discrimination in our state. Iowa has a great civil rights tradition. I was just out with Cory Booker this morning, who reminded Iowa built the most important infrastructure that this country has ever had, and it's called the Underground Railroad. And I think we really need to remind people of that, embrace diversity, embrace inclusion. Don't move. All right.
Excuse me.
Policy-wise, let me tell you guys two things the legislature needs to address. And one is just a renewed emphasis on education. Because one of the things that's so important about the best public schools anywhere in the country is it gives every kid the opportunity regardless of their background. We need to do a lot more on prevention and just in healthcare. I think that's really important. The early childhood stuff we talked about. And finally, we need criminal justice reform in this state. We have a far too great a disparity in our correctional system based on racial factors, and we need to address that. And we also need to do much more as a state to address protections, to end sexual assault, to end
Thank you.
dating violence. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to questions regarding health care, and we'll start with Rob. What are your thoughts on the defunding of family planning programs at Unity Point, the University of Iowa Hospital, and Planned Parenthood? These offered comprehensive women's health services.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. And I think family planning and prevention is really, really important. It's something that should unite Iowans so that people can get access to the preventative health care they need generally, and in particular, the family planning assistance that they need. I just think that's extraordinarily important. And unfortunately, Republicans in the Iowa Senate, Senate File 2 in 2017, started the attack on that and completed that in the Human Service budget last year to spend $3 million of state dollars to replace a federally funded family planning program that resulted in the closing of 4 Planned Parenthood clinics and also the loss of the family planning program at the University of Iowa's hospitals and clinics, and initially at Unity Point as well. And I think that's wrong. I think the single most important thing that we can do to help young people, especially young women, be in control of their futures is to give them access to affordable birth control so that they can be in charge of their own destiny. And it's just really sad to me that that the Republican majority and initially Governor Branstad and the Branstad-Reynolds administration said that this is something that they wanted to stop. It was interesting this summer. I learned, it's been so much about Planned Parenthood that people have overlooked the impact that had on the Unity Point system and also the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. And it's just ridiculous in my mind that you wouldn't allow the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics to participate in the family planning program and that should be reversed.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
In 1971, there was a lady named Jean Franklin, who was a House representative, who stood alone. She was a Democrat, against the governor and both parties, and single-handedly shot down a bill that would have increased abortions in this state. Single-handedly. She said, I don't see any people in my neighborhood lined up, waiting to get an abortion. And I shared about that earlier. Planned Parenthood, sadly, is an oxymoron. The ratio of the number of abortions they perform to the adoption referrals they make is 80 to 1. The ratio of abortions to prenatal care is 40 to 1. There's not a lot of planning going on there. Okay? So I think it's absolutely right that we promote life and save life and direct young women to say, you know what, why don't you wait to get married? Why don't you wait to find a guy who's going to take care of you and take care of your child? There's two basic reasons a lady chooses abortion. And this is discovered by Planned Parenthood, the Guttmacher Institute. Lack of emotional support and lack of material support. Those are the two basic reasons. It's interesting, biblically, the word for father, pater, which from where you get our word patriot from, patrician. That word means one who nourishes and one who supports. You get married, you have a father who's taking care of you and your child, what's your concern? It's pretty simple when you break it down that way. So, I'm supportive of life. That's where I'm going to stand.
Thank you. The next question is on the topic of immigration. And Bernie, you'll get the first chance to respond. It's a very general question. Are you in favor of giving aid to undocumented immigrants?
We need to love our neighbor as ourselves. I get that. But at the same time, we have laws, and those laws need to be followed. It's interesting that people who come here illegally come to a place where there's laws and stability, yet they break the law to do it. They just left a place that was perhaps lawless. Okay? So what I favor is this. Basically, you need to identify yourself, and you need to follow the system. Get in line, okay? Pay your dues, pay your taxes. We will help you, but you need to get in line and identify yourself. Yep, I'm guilty. I need to, get into the system and do it the right way as opposed to doing it the wrong way. Because, who said it? I think it was Martin Luther King. Lawlessness or injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If we open the floodgate, if we open the door, if we crack the door, there will be a floodgate of just illegal activity and just ignorance of law. If you can ignore this law, you can ignore any law. You can just pick a law. Which one do you want to ignore? So I think we need to help folks, but at the same time, I think we need to hold them accountable.
Senator Hogg.
Well, on the immigration issue, I would tell you that in general, it would be my strong preference for have that issue be addressed by our federal government. And the reality is that the last time comprehensive immigration reform was passed at the federal level, it was in 2013 when Democrats were in charge of the United States Senate. Democrats passed a bipartisan bill that featured stronger border control, better employer verification of immigration status, a pathway forward for dreamers who were brought here no fault of their own. And unfortunately, rather than putting that to a vote in the United States House of Representatives, the Republican majority there didn't act on it. And in the 5 years since then, Republicans at the national level haven't acted on it. And I will tell you one of the reasons I believe that is because I think there are a lot of Republican business people, farmers, who have made themselves dependent on undocumented workers and the substandard conditions they can hold them in. So again, I think that is best addressed at the national level. And I would have supported that legislation at the national level in 2013. At the state level, I think it is very, very difficult. And this year, the state passed a bill that was mean-spirited, bad for public safety, bad for local control, and had an unfunded mandate on local governments to do certain things that aren't necessarily even legal in terms of detaining people based on informal requests from federal immigration officials. So I think we need to fix this problem, and I'm just telling you, the only party in the last 5 years that has offered and put up the votes and gotten past a fix to this problem is Democrats in control of the United States Senate in 2013. I think that's where the solution belongs.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes. Oh, we already did immigration, sorry. Next question has to do with workers' rights. And we'll begin with Senator Hogg. What would your stance be on potential legislation to reverse the ban on project labor agreements and lease purchase agreements?
My position on those is I support project labor agreements. For those who don't know what a project labor agreement is, it's where a business, and business communities use this, businesses use this a lot, or a governmental entity will make an arrangement to make sure there are enough workers in place so that you can ensure the timeliness and quality of a project. And I think project labor agreements are beneficial. In Linn County, obviously tried lease purchase agreement as a way to also support local workers. And then the legislature acted to disallow lease purchase agreements by counties or cities. As you may know, the legislature worked to invalidate project labor agreements, which I think is very unfortunate. I opposed that legislation. And of course, the more general issue, the legislature over the last 2 years under Republican control with Republican governors has taken away the collective bargaining rights of public workers and the rights of injured workers, as well as taking away our local minimum wage here, all of which I think is wrong. I think we need to support working families. If you want a strong economy, here's what's in it for everybody. If you want a strong economy, you have to make the economy work for workers. Because if it doesn't, then we have growing income inequality, and the economy doesn't work for everybody, right? So that's my approach. I think you support workers' rights, you support working families, you try to help raise wages and improve benefits, and that would be my approach. That is my approach, and that would be my approach going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
Iowa is a right-to-work state, and being so means that you can work and not have to be a member of a union. I believe, as I've done some research, that the balance of the legislation that has been passed recently brings some fairness to the whole process. PLAs can have a bias towards union work, and crowd out folks who are not union, okay, as they bid for a contract. So I think there's some fairness that's been restored to that process, number one. And sometimes PLAs, and maybe some people would say maybe even oftentimes, lead to inefficiencies because it's just a project that's done through a PLA. So I think there's a balance here that's been brought back into play, and I would be supportive of that. Let me just say this about unions. I believe that unions are necessary. They provide an accountability to employers and managers to treat their workers fair. But I believe at the same time, unions can gravitate to the point where they have enough power that they can represent views and positions that you as a worker don't support. So your union dues are now automatically going to support causes and positions. You say, I'm not for that, but you don't have a choice. Your dues are being taken away or taken out, and now supporting some issue that you wouldn't support at all. So the bottom line is, again, bringing fairness back to the process. The recertification process for unions, to make sure that those union leaders and bosses every 2 years or every contract period are doing and working effectively for you, and so you can either support their recertification or you can say, no, I don't want to support that. So I think there's some fairness that's been brought back to that whole area, and I would be supportive of it.
Thank you. Our next topic is that of mental health. Bernie gets the first response. What can you do to preserve mental health resources in Iowa? What do you do as a community leader to destigmatize mental health issues for Cedar Rapidians?
Well, again, I think it goes back to the family. I think that's where a lot of, sadly, mental health issues originate or start or germinate from. So again, we need to build stable two-parent families. We need to put in place those structures, those procedures that will help people stay together, work together as a family. Do we need to supply funds to help do that? Absolutely. There was a unanimous bill passed in the legislature this session. Unanimous, both parties agreed. We're going to put this funding towards stabilizing and building our mental health system to help people, to reach people. One of the gentlemen that's running for supervisor, John Harris, is a big sponsor of access centers or placement centers that are local centers to help families and help people in need when they have a mental health issue and they need to address it. So I think this is something that, sadly, given the state of where we are in our country and what's going on in the world, that we need to be supportive of that issue and support the families and people that need those things in their lives.
Thank you. Senator Hogg.
On mental health, we absolutely have to have a full range of services, from entry points for people. The most common entry points right now are courts or the emergency rooms or law enforcement. And we really need to get people into this mental health system in different ways, in better ways. We need earlier identification all the way to the people who really need more serious assistance. Right? I mean, the highest level of needs. And unfortunately, what we've had over the last 2 years, or we're going back 4 years now, first of all, the Branstad Reynolds administration arbitrarily closed 2 of the 4 mental health institutes we had in our state. And then the 2 remaining mental health institutes got cut $1.7 million in 2017. And those cuts have exacerbated the problems of people identifying places for the people who are suffering the worst mental health conditions. Where can they get help? The legislation that was passed this year, I voted for it. Bipartisan support, either party in charge, we passed that, right? And we need access centers and we need subacute services. One of the things that bothers me about that legislation, though, is that it is saying to the counties, you're primarily responsible for paying for it. And I don't like it when the state says, here's our solution. Counties, you pay for it. Why doesn't the state step up and pay for it? Well, the reason Governor Reynolds and Republican legislators cut the mental health institutes and don't want to pay for it is they wanted the big tax cut that heavily tilted towards the wealthiest islands. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about that later tonight. But we simply have to say it is no different to have a mental health condition than a physical condition and get the help that you need.
Moving on to the topic of civil rights, we'll begin with Rob. What would you do in legislation to address discrimination and hate crimes toward the LGBTQ community, and how would you address the transgender bathroom accessibility issue?
Okay, first of all, just a little bit of history. Very proud that I was there in 2007, 2008, when we expanded Iowa's civil rights law to include a prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. I was very proud to support that. That was a good thing, and I'm glad we were able to get that done. Obviously, well, I have my fingers crossed that we have a sort of bipartisan support now for the rights of people in the LGBTQ community. I am very hopeful that we're getting to that point. Obviously, there are a lot of people right now worried about with the change in the Supreme Court that marriage equality might go away across the country, and I share those concerns. So I understand that, but we need to continually make progress on inclusion and welcoming people regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In terms of hate crimes, I have been supportive of adding protections for transgender individuals to our hate crimes law. I think it's really sad that we couldn't get a single Republican vote for that when Democrats did that in 2015-16 legislative session. And we need to say no to hate. We need to say no to hate. And that is my position on those issues.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
In April of 2009, I was over at the KCRG studio, and we were dealing with the issue of whether Iowa was going to become a same-sex marriage state. I came in to discuss the issue, and part of the position that I took was this. There was a clash between what we describe and define as civil rights and constitutional rights, particularly First Amendment, religious faith and its practice. And that clash is always going to be there. Now, what I believe is that we have an obligation. My faith values teach me that I have an obligation to love everybody, okay, no matter what their lifestyle and their choice of lifestyle and so on. And that, I think, should be true for all of us, number one. But are there some issues that are going to arise from that? And that question is absolutely. There was the question, you had the question about gender and bathrooms and so on. I believe that you should follow your biological gender when you use a bathroom. That may seem simple, or some people may be offended, but the point is this. There are people that are offended and threatened because someone that looks maybe the opposite gender is now using the bathroom that I would normally use. And how do we resolve that? How do we resolve that? I say follow the biological plan, okay? But bottom line is, yes, we need to be fair to everybody and treat them with love and fairness and uphold those rights. But understand which is going to trump the other. Our constitutional rights, freedom rights, faith rights, going to trump, if you will, or supersede the civil rights that people have passed or believe, they're recorded. And that is an issue that's not going to go away. We're going to have to grapple with that. We don't have any fair answers right now, but we're going to have to grapple with that. And I trust that we can come up with a fair situation in the end.
Thank you. Next topic is the state budget, and we will begin with Bernie. How would you balance the state budget when revenues are less than expenditures, and conversely, when revenues exceed expenditures?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question, because my plan is this. When I look at our tax system, how we take in revenues and so on, it's only going to support us for so long down the road, and I think we need to make a significant change. And my proposals, in terms of change, is what is called the fair tax. The fair tax is a consumption tax. It's a sales tax. It replaces the revenue that we presently take in when we pick that tax rate, somewhere, let's call it 23%. What that means to you is, for example, you get to keep your whole paycheck. Your whole paycheck. There's no withdrawal for income, FICA, Social Security, Medicare. You keep it all, okay? You only pay a tax when you purchase something new or you take on a service. So you get to determine when you're actually taxed. Used items are not taxed, okay? A consumption base is a more stable base than the revenue base, income base that we're using now. And everybody pays the same rate. It's a broader base. It's a broader base. It's more predictable. So in terms of revenue, whether we met it or whether we did, you know what? It's much more stable. It's much more easier to figure out. It's harder to cheat because it takes two of you to cheat. The person who's purchasing something, the person who's receiving the money for it. It's you don't even fill out a form, okay? No more information to the IRS every year. No more spending hours going to the tax man and so on. Gone. It's lower administrative costs, okay? Point of sale, that percentage goes off to the government, to the state. It's a done deal. So my answer is a big answer. It's an overhaul of the tax system as we know it. But I think it's to our advantage if we do that.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what the legislature did over the last 2 years. I mentioned in my opening comment about major and repeated mid-year budget cuts. And just so everybody in this room knows, there was absolutely no need for any of those budget cuts. There was no need for any of those budget cuts because the state has always had rainy day funds well in excess of what was cut. So the Republican theory was we didn't have enough money, so we needed to do major cuts to our universities, big cuts to our community college, right? Reynolds talks about future-ready Iowa, but then she turns around and cuts our community colleges. So that doesn't add up. Big cuts to human services, public safety, corrections, victim services cut, $1.7 million for support for survivors of sexual assault and domestic abuse. That's wrong. Natural resources cuts that we need to guard against flooding. And it turned out that they didn't make all these cuts because we didn't have enough money. It turned out they made all these cuts because they wanted massive tax cuts for the wealthiest taxpayers in Iowa. The average tax cut for somebody making $1 million a year or more, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands who here is making $1 million a year or more, right? But the average tax cut is $18,773 next year, right? Well, we're making all these cuts that help working families and ordinary people and keep public safety. And that is wrong. And I would just say here, I think what I heard is let's eliminate all income taxes, which would make the budget situation an absolute disaster unless you crank up sales taxes so high that that becomes onerous on the poor and working families across our state.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to the topic of human trafficking, and we'll begin with Rob. What steps would you take in order to prevent human trafficking in our peaceful Cedar Rapids and in our state?
Well, this has been a very important issue, and I will tell you, in the legislature, not everybody is an expert on every issue, right? And so I really follow the lead of one of our great state senators, Kevin Kinney, who's a retired deputy sheriff, who has been involved in the arrest and prosecution of dozens, if not more, human traffickers, right? And I do follow his lead. But let me tell you, for me, I used to hear that term, and it was kind of like, you know, and I felt like, oh, so there are people being abducted internationally and sold into slavery in the United States, and that was my original conception. That wasn't right. What it's basically about is forcing primarily, but not exclusively, young women, there are young men who get forced into it, into illegal sex trade. So it has totally changed the way I think about it. Somebody gets arrested for prostitution, for being the prostitute, well, the chances are that person is likely a victim of human trafficking. And so we need to recognize, hey, something that for years we thought of as a crime and we need to arrest all these people, now is what they really need is services. That's why I get so bothered when I see something like cuts to survivors of sexual assault and domestic abuse. That's wrong. And just like it is wrong to impose draconian criminal sentences on somebody who's really been victimized. So it's we need the support for public safety officials. That's more important than more tax cuts for the wealthiest taxpayers, in my opinion. And that's where I think we need to provide support to law enforcement and education around the issue.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
In the past, I've attended some seminars in regard to human trafficking, several of them put on by a gentleman named Tony Nassif, related to the Nassif family here in Cedar Rapids. There's several organizations around that are working to prevent and disrupt and take down these networks that promote human trafficking. Obviously with illegal aliens, that's their bailiwick. It's quote unquote ready made, and it's sad. But I think, to me, the bigger answer, the bigger approach is this: we all need to be our brother's keeper. Okay. When I served on the board at Bridgehaven, we had a situation where a young lady came in for a test, and some of the information that was transferred led us to believe that there was a situation going on there that was not right. And so we had to either report it, act on it, and respond. So I think it's all of our job. It's easy to say the government should do this, the government should do that. Why don't all of us get involved? I worked with autopilots for years, and we would engage the autopilot, we would sit back and we would go, it's doing its job. But there's some jobs that the autopilot should not do. And one of them in most airplanes is you don't let the autopilot land the airplane unless it's got auto land. Okay, that's not going to work. We need to be engaged. All of us need to be engaged and working and sensitive wherever we are to a need or a situation to be able to say, hey, I question what's going on there, and maybe we need to call in some authorities and relate that issue to someone so that we can get some help and free some people.
Thank you. Our next topic is that of communication. And we'll begin with Bernie. What would you do to improve communication with the constituents in your district?
Well, I put up some billboards, trying to convince them that I'm not Bernie Sanders. I think one of the things that we can do, and I think Rob would agree with this too, is just be the example and get out there, write letters, act, get involved, stay involved, and bring people alongside with us to say, here's what's important, here's why we need to do this. I believe our founders intended and designed for our government for the constituents to be involved. A lot of people like term limits. Every election is a term limit. Every election is a term limit in my book. Okay, and that means that we need to know who's running and why they're running and where they stand. And I thank you folks for coming out tonight because you care. And you need to transfer that same care to your neighbors, to your friends, to your relatives, and say, you know what, you need to go find out about these people. They've got websites, they've got email, they've got Twitter accounts, whatever. Find out what they believe and why they stand there, and get involved and make a decision, because it determines the future. I knocked on the house of a guy one day. He says, I'm not into politics. And I thought, yeah, but politics is all over you. You know, didn't want to know, didn't care, whatever. That was his choice. But you know, it does affect you. And if you pretend like it doesn't, you're kidding yourself. You're kidding yourself. So I think that's the way to communicate, is to get out there, be that example that people can see it, and hopefully it will rub off.
Thank you. Ron.
Well, I've served in Iowa legislature. I have tried to be very accessible to people, and I will say up front, I know I don't do a perfect job with it, but I think I've been very responsive to people who email me, who call, who come to events that I have, and it is important for legislators to be accessible, and I have tried very, very hard to do that over the years. For example, I come to the League of Women Voters forums. I don't avoid them like some legislators in county do. And I think it's important to be accessible. But I do want to say that I do think we're at a moment in time where we really need to call upon citizens to be more engaged than we've been. And I don't want to blame people for not being involved. And I look at, you know, kind of the terrible state of the negative advertising that happens, and the role of campaign finance, and the reality that, you know, people spend all their time raising money rather than visiting with people. We need to heal the heart of democracy, uplift our democracy, call on citizens to a new era of engagement, participation. And I think we do that. You know, when you think about the wealth and the technology of the 21st century, I think we really have the opportunity to build a safe, healthy, prosperous, inclusive, caring, even loving community that brings people together. But we can't do that if we're focused on raising big money and then passing big tax cuts so our donors get big tax breaks. That's a bad place for our democracy to be. So over the next 28 days, get engaged, get involved, and let's see if we can turn this thing around.
Thank you. Next question has to do with our justice system, and we'll begin with Rob. Funding for Iowa's prisons and courts has been reduced for several years. Safety in prisons and timely access to the courts have suffered. Would you support restoration or funding for our justice system?
I leaned against her.
The answer to that question is yes. I do support restoration funding for our courts and corrections. Remember, access to the courts is really important for the people involved. And when I say the people involved, I'm talking about the parties, the criminal defendants, the person seeking protection from domestic abuse, the person seeking a commitment of a loved one for mental health conditions. We need our courts to be open and accessible. And when, in 2017, Governor Branstad, the Republicans cut $3 million from the budget of the courts in the middle of the year. This year, Governor Reynolds, the Republicans did again at the tune of $1.6 million. That's bad. Corrections. I want to make sure people understand what corrections does. We do have the institutions that house about 8,200, 8,300 inmates right now, and safety in those institutions is very important. And by the way, we have had a surge in the number of attacks on our correctional officers because of budget cuts and staffing shortages. But remember, community corrections also supervises 27,000 people who are out on release from the institutions or under probation or parole, right? So it is a major factor in our community's safety. And when you cut community corrections, like has happened, all total, corrections has lost $16 million over the last 2 years, $3.3 million on an ongoing basis. And when you take that money, that's, by the way, that's not a reduction compared to inflation. That's an actual cut to corrections. And when you cut community corrections, you force more people out of the prison system. There has been an increase in recidivism in our state. Nearly 500 more crimes are being committed each year under the new rate of recidivism than what it was just 4 years ago, and that's because of cuts to corrections.
Thank you. Bernie.
Both my parents were involved in the criminal justice system. My dad, actually for a period of about 10 years, taught at the Baltimore City Jail. My mom was a teacher at the Women's Correctional Facility in Jessup, Maryland for about 30 years. We need to provide the funds that are needed to make sure those people are safe and that the system works well. I'm all supportive of that. But at the same time, I think we need to get in a mindset that says we're not going to accept the status quo. We're not going to just build more prisons, hire more policemen, put up more cameras. That's why we need to focus on stemming the problem by building families. Like I said, you take a dad out of the home, you're 20 times more likely that that kid's going to end up in prison. If you had 4 adult black men standing here, one of those 4 has already been in prison. That's how bad it is in the black community. So, yes, I'm supportive of that. Let's just do it. We have to deal with where we are right now, but at the same time, we need to work on turning the spigot off. You know, well, why wouldn't we? And I think that initiatives like building families are the place where we begin, and we can do that. And we can. Wouldn't it be awesome if we were closing down a prison? Wouldn't that just be awesome? I mean, that would be awesome to me anyway. So that's where I'm at on that.
Thank you. The next question is a voting rights question, and actually it has to do with felons. As you know, Iowa is one of 3 states that does not automatically restore voting rights to felons who have served their time. How do you feel about restoring voting rights to felons? Bernie.
Well, I believe after they've served their time, if they've done their time, then restore their rights. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward. I think anybody would appreciate that value, that right to vote, that will be involved in the decision process, and we want to integrate these folks back into the community, into the society. So let's do it.
I also support the restoration of voting rights for felons who have served their time. And that was the law in Iowa under Governor Vilsack and then under Governor Culver. Unfortunately, on the first day of the Branstad administration in 2011, he reversed that and took away the restoration of voting rights for felons. And that's wrong because somebody who has served his or her time should be able to participate. But when I first learned about this issue, I went to the people at Community Corrections and I asked them for their opinion on it. Because I said, you're more familiar in this situation than I am, so what would you advise? And I remember Gene Keel and Yuri Hinsman and Bruce Vandersand and people telling me, you should restore the rights because anything you do to bring somebody back into the community reduces the chance of recidivism. And this is really a simple, no-cost way of doing it by restoring voting rights. We know there are ways of reducing recidivism. It involves education, housing, employment, and substance abuse and mental health treatment. And this is why, back to the last question, when you're cutting community corrections and cutting corrections, you take away that chance, and restoration of voting rights is something that can do that. Now, that depends on who the governor is under our Constitution. Our Constitution dedicates that decision to the governor. Hopefully, we will have a governor in January who will restore voting rights for felons. That's my opinion. But if not, I do think maybe we need to discuss having a constitutional amendment to address that provision.
Thank you. Our next topic is higher education. We'll start with Senator Hogg. Rob, what would you do to maintain quality of higher education in Iowa and make it economically accessible to all students?
Well, thank you for that question. And higher education is very, very important. And again, on the theme of kind of what's in it for all of us, right? Obviously, it's important for the students and families involved. It's also very, very important for our economy. When I look around across the country at the places that are doing the best economically, there is almost always at the center of it a major research institution and the highest quality higher education. I love the University of Iowa. Don't be offended if you're an Iowa State fan, but I want Iowa State to do well. I want you and I to do well. We have great universities, and our private colleges are critical, as well as our community colleges. So what do we need to do? We need to restore the funding that's been cut. Community colleges lost $5.25 million over the last 2 years in the mid-year cuts. We need to restore that and get the resources we need so that we can have the apprenticeships and the vocational education and the other general education that our community colleges like Kirkwood provide to get us on a path to good paying jobs. The universities, they have been decimated. Over $30 million in cuts over the last 2 years mid-year. $30 million. We are now, as a state, we're now providing $96 million less to our universities than we did in 2008. And it is less than it was in 1999. We obviously need to restore investment in our universities, tuition and fees, without talking about living expenses. Tuition and fees at our universities now over $9,000, right? And it is costing people out of the opportunity for college education. So we need to reverse that. We need to invest in higher education.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
There were some recent cuts to our higher education university system. My understanding is that those cuts were made because they wanted to force those systems to better manage the funds that they were getting. And the funds that were set aside were specifically targeted for tuition reduction. Okay, so long term, what I think we need to do, I mentioned about building stable two-parent families, is provide incentives that encourage people to stay together. And one of the things we could do is, as you stay together as a family, as you graduate high school and consider university, why not give them a tuition credit or tax credit so that their tuition costs are even lower? Let them have some skin in the game. One of the things that we face is the whole Medicaid system and its funding. What about a shared savings account that goes for a long-term care plan for you? Now, as a young person, you think, oh, I don't need long-term care, I'm not even thinking about it. But you will later on, okay? And it's costly. It runs about $200 a day. And you think, well, I'll never need it, I'll never be there. Yeah, you may be there. And then where does the funding come from? But if you can start an account and save it up and use it, borrow from it, etc., it's your account, it's your money, and it's an inducement to build stable two-parent families, why would you do that? And I think that would be a great way to fund our education as well as long-term care and so on, if we took that route.
Thank you. Our next question has to do with a topic very near and dear to us, flood protection. We'll begin with Bernie. What can you do at the state level to secure and protect flood prevention projects in Linn County?
And many of you, I mean, honestly, we're all residents of Cedar Rapids, 2008, the whole devastation of the flood. My big thought was this. Everybody said, well, that's a 500-year flood. And yet, a few years down the road, we were facing another, what looked like maybe, call it a 400-year, 350-year flood. Here we are again. We need to immediately put in place a system that would protect us temporarily. You know, something, the HESCO barriers or something, whatever it is, but we needed to assure ourselves that we have a system that will keep us from flooding, number one, the next time, until we get the permanent system in place. So I would absolutely be for the temporary system, putting that in place, making sure that's going to protect us until we figure out, get the funding, whatever it is we need to do to build the permanent system. But there's no point in pretending that it's not going to happen again, because it's already happening. It's already happening. We're looking at High River even now. So I think the whole point is this, is to do it. Just do it. Just make it happen. Get to the state, get the funding set aside that we need to make sure that we don't have to go through that again.
Thank you.
There's so much to say in 2 minutes. The flood of 2008 was an awful experience for those of us who lived through it. It was emotionally traumatic for many people. It was economically devastating for many people. It was economically devastating for our community. Thank goodness we got state assistance and federal assistance. I always worked hard on that to get recovery to the people and the businesses that needed help. I worked very hard on that. But I always said we've got to do it in a way that is smarter and safer and more sustainable than before. And so starting in 2008, right after that flood, that was the focus. And we did a lot of things in 2009 and 2010 to advance that. A lot of flood mitigation was embedded in our recovery efforts. In 2012, in divided government, I led the effort to get an Iowa flood mitigation program established. And we had a Democratic-controlled Senate, 26-24, a Republican House, a Republican governor. I worked and worked and worked on that, and I was deploying all of the resources I had to get that done, and we passed that in the Senate 50-0. It made it unstoppable in the House, even though there were a few no votes there. And of course, Governor Branstad signed it. And thanks to that program, which has already put flood mitigation in place for Dubuque, Waverly, Iowa City, Coralville, Burlington project's underway, Storm Lake it's underway, Council Bluffs underway, here it's underway. And we've already avoided tens of millions of dollars of damage, if not more, because we haven't added up what just happened last week, right, from those investments. And we have to do it. It takes more than flood infrastructure though. We also need comprehensive watershed management, and I'm out of time.
Thank you. Our next question is on the topic of bipartisanship. What would keep you from working across the aisle?
Well, that's an interesting way of phrasing that question. So let me start by saying I have been there in all the different settings where Democrats have had control, where you've had a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature, and you've had split control. I've been there in all the scenarios. And one of the things I've always prided myself on, like with the flood mitigation program, solar energy tax credits, social host legislation, updating our criminal transmission of HIV law, Social Security, cutting taxes on Social Security income, all sorts of issues, working across the aisle to get things done. Unfortunately, in 2016, voters of the state delivered to us a Republican majority House, a Republican majority Senate, Governor Branstad Reynolds administration, and leaders in that situation that were kind of hell-bent on running ideological and partisan legislation, and boy did they. And so we have played as much defense as we could possibly play, full court press defense, over the last 2 years to stop the tax on workers' rights, to stop the tax on women's rights, to stop the tax on immigrants, to stop the tax on voting rights, to stop these major budget cuts that have done so much damage, to stop the attack on clean energy, energy efficiency. I mean, the reckless tax cuts. We've tried everything we can to stop that, but they have been hell-bent on using their single power control and flexing their power. And I obviously continue, if there are issues that I can work on across aisles, I can, but it's pretty hard when you're playing defense on dozens of major issues to have the time to do that, because you've got to stand up against these really bad things they're doing. So hopefully it's in the hands of voters and they'll return at least
Thank
split
you.
controls of the Iowa legislature next year.
Mr. Hayes?
I think the basic question was, what would keep you from working across the aisle?
Yes.
For me, the answer would be nothing, except that obviously recognize that we have different values and different perspectives on how we're going to approach a situation or a concern or an issue and how we resolve it. Sometimes there is middle ground. Sometimes there is not middle ground. You know, it's going to be one or the other. You can't have both necessarily. It's just not going to work. But I think it's more in the attitude and the values that we bring to the situation. You know, Rob mentioned, you know, the latest administration. Well, what was it like when Grosso was in charge of the Senate? What did the Republicans do? Okay. So it works both ways. And I think what it comes down to is, are we going to be Iowans and try to develop programs that bless Iowans and bless America, or are we going to be partisan? I mentioned June Frank earlier. I mean, that lady's my hero. I mean, she's a Democrat. I'll vote for any Democrat that's going to stand for life, anytime, any place, anywhere. So, I mean, there are things we can agree on. There's things that maybe we can find some common ground on, and certainly we have to be practical. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what you value and what you believe. And as much as we can, I'll tell you, my goal, if I ever get there, is that I want them on my side. I want them to see the value in the things that we present and say, you know what? That's a great idea, let's come over there, or maybe we can adjust it a little bit, whatever it is, but let's see if we can't work together and get there for the benefit of everybody.
Thank you. Okay, this is going to be our last question before the closing statements. Remember that the library closes at 8. We invite you to stay to talk individually with our candidates, but we'd also ask that you be mindful of the time frame that we have to work under. I'm sorry we got a late start because of the weather, and anyone who's inclined to help put away chairs and things, we would welcome that. So, the last question has to do with IPERS, the Iowa Public Employee Retirement System. It's an easy question. What is the future of IPERS? And Bernie, you get to start.
So here's the deal. The company I worked for in Rockwell, back in about 2003, 2006, had a pension plan. And they decided, as they looked out at the liability of carrying that pension plan, it was going to be untenable. So they decided to cut the pension plan off at a certain time, and then they instituted a defined contribution program, which they match savings that the employee put away with whatever percentage they picked. It was up to like 8%. You take 8% of your earnings, and the company would match that 8% or 6% or whatever it was. I am living on that plan right now. I'm retired, and I'm hoping it's going to work. It's not just Rockwell, it's other companies. And we need to do the same thing. We need to have, even if you're a state employee, you need to have skin in the game. Okay? We need to just stop putting it into a piggy bank and saying, well, I hope it'll be there at the end of the day. Okay? Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you follow the model that the industry is already using and working, okay, to ensure that those funds are going to be there? That's my answer.
Thank you. Rob?
I think that sounded a little bit like not interested in continuing IPERS. And I will just say I am a strong supporter of the IPERS system. I believe that having pension benefits is a good thing. And I believe in retirement security for not just public workers, but all workers. And to me, the answer is not to take IPERS away and replace it with something. It's to keep IPERS because it is a strong, solvent program that's doing very well in terms of its investments. But then if you want to increase retirement security beyond that, encourage employees to do that. And I think this whole movement away, it all really gets down to kind of the stock market, right? And doing things to help boost out-of-state corporations and their profits. And I don't like that. I want us to have a good, strong public system. I want us to have a good, strong Social Security system at the national level and add on to it. Here's my concern. The question was, what's the prospects for it? And I know we've had a few people, you just heard what Mr. Hayes said, what Bernie said. We have had proposals from people like Senator Zahn to eliminate, going forward, the IPERS system that would totally undermine the people who are already in the system by taking new people out. And I think that is a mistake. And even though you have other people saying that won't happen from the Republican side, they also didn't campaign on getting rid of collective bargaining rights in 2016, right? And then, even after that election, they said they were going to do minor tweaks to it. And then in 9 days, they rammed through the gutting of collective bargaining rights, right? Well, I'm concerned that if this election doesn't at least restore Democrats to some control of state government, that they will ram through the dismantling of ICOs.
Thank you. So we'd like to close the forum by thanking both of the candidates for their participation in our democratic process. I'd also like to thank the Cedar Rapids Public Library and staff for their help in providing this facility. And we'll ask now each of the candidates to give a 2-minute closing statement. And you go first.
Well, thanks to the League of Women Voters and thanks to all of you for participating tonight. It's been good to talk to you about this. As you can see, there are a lot of issues. And I want to get back to the 2 fundamental things I talked about. Is number 1, undoing the damage that Republicans have done to our state over the last 2 years. And number 2, really working hard for that vision of a better state going forward. To me, the facts matter, and I want people to know I believe in civic engagement, citizen understanding of what's happening. So there was the tax cut that they passed, heavily weighted towards the wealthiest taxpayers, that nearly $19,000 that the $1 million incomes get. There were the mid-year cuts to education, public safety, human services, natural resources. The cuts to the flood center and other programs to prevent future flood damage. Taking away family planning, which was wrong. Trying to take away women's rights. The attack on workers' rights, taking away our minimum wage, taking away rights of injured workers. The Medicaid mess. We haven't talked enough about health care tonight. There's also the cuts to substance abuse treatment, tobacco prevention, medical education, mental health. Cuts in services for sexual assault and domestic violence survivors. That's wrong. Shortchanging our public schools. Actually cutting, not keeping up with inflation with our public schools, but then actually cutting early childhood, community colleges, and our universities. Cuts to aging services. Cuts to the Iowa Veterans Home. We haven't talked about the veterans tonight. Cuts to veterans homeowner grants. And to me, we've got to choose a better direction for our state and our future. And I ask for your support any day now, between now and November 6th.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
If you read U.S. News and World Report, you know that Iowa was rated the #1 state in the nation. I don't think it got that rating by accident. And there's lots of other states that vie for that position. So under this Republican administration, not perfect, many of the categories said, Iowa is doing it right. We're stable, we're solid, our bills are paid, we're managed well. What are you going to say? Actually, I'll just say for the other side, I know they have a hard road to hoe because, when you're rated #1, where do you go from there? Okay, we're not perfect. I was looking at the tax rates the other night, and I was thinking, if you look at it overall, it is kind of lopsided. And I was thinking, I'm the new guy on the block, but I'm doing my research, trying to find out. I'm thinking a lot of those maybe incomes are farmers that buy very big capital equipment, and it looks like income, but they're actually borrowing a bunch of money from the bank to pay for that stuff. Maybe they need a tax break. It's pretty risky business. It's risky now. I mean, you can't even get out into the fields because it's so wet. So, it's not all that it may appear to be on the surface. And I've been a Republican since 1980. I know, for example, that at least the people that I know in the Republican Party are not all these rich fat cats running around, just looking for a break. It's not that way. It's just not that way. We're Iowans just like you. We have needs just like you. I go to Northbrook Care Center 5 days a week to take care of a lady that I've known for 40 years. And I have a vested interest in that outcome and how she's cared for and what happens. Besides, her husband is a big guy, and when I get to heaven, I want to report to him that I took very good care of her because he would just sit on her. Okay? So, let me just share this as I close. When I put out my card to people, some places say no solicitation. And I'm really kind of struck by that because it's like, you're turning down information. My cards don't say vote for me. okay? My cards don't ask you to give me a donation. It's just simply information. And I can't understand why people turn down information when it
Thank
comes
you.
time to vote. So
Thank you.
don't do that, vote.
So we now have a chance to actually applaud with our hands.